For thousands of years, plague, superstition, and murder have drenched Britain and Ireland with blood and misery. Those dark memories still haunt our ancient lands. That's why we call them the Spooky Isles.
Welcome to the Spooky Isles. This is David Saunderson. We're live today at the upstairs at the Gatehouse, one of the most haunted pubs in Highgate, making it possibly one of the most haunted places in Britain. I'm joined today by Della Farrant, who is the author of the upcoming History Press book, Haunted Highgate, and joining me today to interview Della and look around this very atmospheric theatre that we're sitting in now is my colleague John Kaneko-James. G'day, John.
Hello there, David.
How are you feeling today sitting here at the...
I'm really loving it. It's a lovely space. Very, very atmospheric.
It's purple and black and dark.
It is, with some very nice little sort of quite Victorian-y shell lights over all the old-style heaters, which... No, I like it. It's a really nice space. I'm very looking forward to having a chat here.
And also joining us is our regular guest who, for a person who came on once, has never really left us.
You can't get rid of me, can you?
Paul's joining us. He's a long-time author, a paranormal author, so he'll bring in some his rare knowledge of the paranormal to have a discussion. But first, we best introduce Della Farrant. Hello, Della.
Hello, David. Lovely to be here with the guys.
That's great. Is this your first book?
Yes, it is.
And it's a big one, isn't it? Haunted Highgate.
It is. Originally, they wanted me to do Haunted Highgate and Hampstead, which would have been impossible. And even with a 5,000-word extension and very small prints, I've still had to leave a lot of stories out.
Yeah, Highgate and Hampstead are really worth their own books, aren't they?
Definitely.
I mean, Hampstead has so many haunted pubs and things like that, never mind Highgate, so...
It does.
Will there be a haunted Hampstead?
Hopefully. We'll see how the first one goes, but very likely.
So tell us about Haunted Highgate. When did you start writing it?
Approximately 2 years ago. The intention was to write a much bigger book which went into folklore and a lot more history. And even though I'm writing for the History Press, because the focus is primarily on the paranormal, you have to put a bit of a cap on how much historical information you can include, although I've tried to squeeze a lot of history in because we're somewhere so old. Clearly you need to understand the landscape and the history of the inhabitation of the site, or you can't make any sense of the ghost. So I've tried to strike a balance there.
Yeah, you live in Highgate, don't you?
Yes.
So you're doing this as a local.
Yes.
So
yes.
you might have been researching it for 2 years, but you must have known a lot of this stuff before you even started.
Yes, but also there's stuff that you find out as you go along which you would never anticipate.
Okay, well, tell us a little bit about that then. What are some strange and wonderful things you've found out since your research?
I'm working on something that's quite amusing at the moment concerning the Prince Regent and a gambling den on West Hill, and some rather sordid practices that went on West Hill involving ladies of the night and very large walls to protect the genteel inhabitants of Highgate from seeing some naughty goings on, for example.
And has that led to some paranormal activity?
Not so much. I mean, there is a suicide by shotgun in the midst of all this Regency drama, but
Crumbs.
I don't believe that area is particularly haunted because of that, no.
Okay, so it's just some strange and weirdo type of things going on.
Yeah, it's the dark, hidden stuff that's more to do with human behaviour, which is common everywhere, but perhaps is sometimes assumed to not take place in Highgate, which is, for anyone who's never been here is not aware, it's an incredibly gentrified area, which has remained pretty much untouched. It's rather like going back in time.
Yeah, very
That's
much
the
so.
impression I get when you come here. It's almost like a sort of little bubble, isn't it? It's almost like stepping back into a Victorian era. I don't think I know of another place in London that's got that feel to it.
I was going to say it's one of those little London villages. Dulwich Village in southeast London has that similar thing. You just cross from East Dulwich, which is just a very normal suburb, and you walk about 10 minutes, and then again is this Highgate feel where suddenly, bam, you're in a village, you're in a little community in its own right, and that is really fantastic.
Kind of feel, isn't it? Yeah.
You could almost feel like you're going to get held up by a highwayman at some stage when you're walking down some of these leafy
Absolutely,
roads.
definitely.
Which used to be very common.
I'm sure it was. Now, as we said, we're upstairs at the Gateway, which is the name of the theatre that we're sitting
the Gatehouse.
Gatehouse. What did I say?
Gateway.
Gateway.
Well, it's interesting you say that because...
There's a pub where I'm from in Australia that's called the Gateway. So
that's probably what you were thinking of, but the Gatehouse is actually named the Gatehouse for the Gateway, which it used to be attached to, I think it was 1716 or so that the gate was taken down.
No, it was my mistake just for being silly.
But it's very relevant. It's
yes.
very relevant.
So we're sitting here because we're very fortunate that John Pluse's let us come in here today, because he doesn't normally do that, does he?
No, he's quite reluctant to.
Yes.
It's a working theatre. They have lots of performances here. It's one of the most popular theatres in North London. Very established. Began in Camden. And it's a great place, and he just simply doesn't have the time. But that's not to say that he's not sympathetic to the peculiar atmosphere here, and he's also had some experiences here himself.
Well, we're going to talk to him a little bit later, so we'll be able to hear directly from him what the paranormal activity here is. But could you give us a bit of a background on it, so when people do hear from John, they can understand why this is such a paranormal activity of a place?
The building we're sitting in today, and it's very difficult to date it precisely, but we know that there's been a building on this site since the 1300s. And originally, the purpose of that building was a hermitage for tolls to be collected by a hermit on behalf of the Bishop of London for people who wished to travel through Highgate to get to the north or vice versa. And so it has a history of flux, which I think is possibly significant for what gives it such an impressionable psychic atmosphere. Mm-hmm. So many thousands, if probably not millions over the years, of people have travelled through Highgate. It's very close to where we're sitting now. So you have that aspect going on. It's also a place of boundaries. It's traditionally been a boundary of two parishes, latterly two local authorities. So it kind of represents possibly a space in between, a space of journeying, a place where you're journeying between one place to another, or you're sitting on the boundary of two places, much like a crossroads. And in fact, it is on a crossroads. And we all know that crossroads have a reputation for being particularly psychically active areas. So this building was first licensed as a pub in 1670, but we think we know it was domestically inhabited prior to that. It's been substantially remodelled over the years, primarily I think in 1890, and then in 1905 it acquired its mock Tudor look that you see now. However, the part of the building that we're sitting in now, upstairs, as you mentioned, David, in the theatre, just behind us, is probably the oldest part of the original building. And fittingly, it's where the majority of the activity that's been reported over the years takes place. It's impossible to say how much of it is substantially older than the Victorian remodelling, but it's certainly not true, as some sources claim, that the pub was pulled down altogether in Victorian times and rebuilt. It was not. Graffiti has been discovered dating back to 1716 in a secret room downstairs, for example, which survived the remodelling and wasn't even discovered during it. So
that's fantastic. Would you mind if I asked what the kind of... Because this is very near to the gate, or where the gate originally was, isn't it? Now, what's the relationship between the gate and the hermitage and the pub? Because there was a hermitage connected to the gate which collected the tolls, am I right?
Yes, that's correct. And there was a kind of bridge that went across the road, and it linked to the chapel of Ease, because Highgate never had a church of its own until 1832.
Wow.
So the Chapel of Ease at the Cholmondeley School was the closest thing they had. So you could literally walk across this bridge from the old core of the building, just behind us, over the road into the graveyard. So there's a direct kind of link there, which is a bit spooky. And everything in Highgate is very close, because it's much smaller
it's a very small area.
People might think.
That's really interesting, because in my own research I came across the anecdote about how the people of Highgate rioted and the hermit had to hide in the tower of his hermitage at one point.
Well, that's a funny thing as well, because he claimed that I think they were beating the bounds and using an old right-of-way, which went through his garden, and he got a bit upset about that, and he claimed they broke his fences down and so on. But then he sort of put in the equivalent of an insurance claim for some books that were meant to have been stolen from him during this crazy riot, which he'd actually pawned the previous week.
Those naughty hermits.
Naughty hermit, yes.
So we're going to get, in the book, obviously there's a lot about the Gatehouse, and people will be able to learn about that, but obviously there's some other strange things that have happened, like what John just said about the hermit. There's other haunted pubs in Highgate as well, aren't there?
Yes, the Flask is the traditionally most haunted pub. Funnily enough, it's primarily haunted during the summertime. The Flask, you could date the oldest parts of the Flask to the oldest parts of the Gatehouse that are extant, unless there's any 1300s remains in here somewhere. It's mostly in the summer, as I say, and it seems to be primarily a female presence. There is a legend of a cavalier who appears in full period costume, and it's not so much a legend. It was last seen in 2012, and
that's cool.
A businessman saw him who'd never been to Highgate before, was eating his lunch and freaked out because he saw this guy just stride across the pub, and the bar staff sort of laughed and said, "Oh, you must have seen the cavalier," and he stormed out and swore, well, obviously, what the beep was
yes,
that?
Indeed.
Yeah.
And when they were laughing at him, he looked at them like a bunch of freaky yokels, like something out of League of Gentlemen, and just went, "And you think this is normal?" and stormed off.
Is that normal? Is it normal in Highgate to see these type of things?
Pretty much, yes. Yeah.
Would you say more than any other part of London? I mean, we said that this is a very haunted place, is Highgate. Do you think that, do you believe that it's the most haunted place in Britain?
I think when somewhere has a reputation for being haunted and people go to the place hoping to see something, perhaps they are energising what may be there already and maybe giving it a little bit more of a longevity and a life force than it would have otherwise. Whether that means that's one way of looking at it, or it could be collective hysteria and active imagination.
What's your favourite? Oh, sorry, John.
I was probably a little from column A and a little from column B, just in the sense that if you come here expecting to see something, and then you're walking around thinking, what can I slot into that definition of the supernatural, you'll see something.
Every leaf that floats away or something like that.
But also, it's one of those things that sort of the expectation of seeing something can also fuel ghosts. I mean, you have the whole idea. That's why we traditionally do these things in the dark by firelight, etc., to make a more conducive atmosphere to sort of sensitivity. Blavatsky would talk about vibrations and all of this sort of thing, no doubt.
I would say that much as a kind of ostension theory and legend tripping has its applications and its validity and could be applied to some of the witness, I'm making inverted commas signs for the, for the benefit of those who can't see me, witnesses I've interviewed. Sometimes I've thought, with all due respect, I think that you got carried away and imagined that.
Yes.
However, that doesn't nullify the fact that Highgate, in my opinion, is genuinely haunted, and I base that opinion on the sincerity of the many, many people I've interviewed throughout the process of researching this book.
Absolutely, because this is the most interesting thing for me when people tell me ghost stories. I do ghost tours, I write about medieval history and folklore and things, so people tell me ghost stories. And the most interesting ones are the ones where somebody gets no kudos from telling the story. They are somebody who isn't excited by having had an experience.
Exactly.
In fact, they're somebody who's embarrassed and disturbed by having had an experience. And those people are the ones where, it's not great for them, but from our perspective, those ones are the interesting ones where you sort of sit and think, okay, that's something, because you would never have said that if it wasn't eating away at you. If you could explain that away, you would have just gone back to bed and thought, it's the moonlight reflecting off a weather balloon or something.
A lot of people have asked to be anonymised for exactly that reason, because they're embarrassed. But I should clarify, it's not as if everybody who lives in Highgate goes around bragging about or openly discussing the fact that they live in a haunted place. It's quite the opposite. It's actually quite frowned upon as a topic of conversation.
Oh, there was one question I wanted to ask you. In all seriousness, very serious topic. Why did the frozen chicken cross the road?
Well, one theory that I've proposed in my book, if you're referring to the frozen chicken of Pont Square...
Yes, I am.
...is that it was possibly a live chicken that had been savaged by a fox, which had been disturbed by the light of the night watchman, who saw this chicken, and
and so that is the source of the ghost chicken, which
that is so boring. I want the frozen chicken. I want the Tesco's chicken crossing the road. So.
Allegedly, you see, for those who might not know the story, the story goes that Francis Bacon, of course, died in Highgate. I believe he died of pneumonia, didn't he?
Debatable.
Well, it's one of the possible stories, but
was it pneumonia or was it a drug overdose?
Knowing about the economics of the time, it was pneumonia. We didn't have much of a drug trade at the time. We had opium and psilocybin mushrooms, but I mean, if we're talking about Francis Bacon, this is the 17th century. We hadn't yet gotten massively into the opium or sort of hemp smoking trades. Those were a bit later.
Nitrates?
I don't know how early they came in. I always thought they were later. I mean, there was a lot of booze around at the time, but all that sort of drug stuff is a bit later, I think.
Well, for the sake of the ghosty, let's go for the banana.
Either way, he was stuffing a chicken with snow to prove that he could preserve flesh, is the story.
It's
and
the
that
story.
both he and the chicken haunt Highgate.
Absolute rot.
Separately.
Absolute rot.
Have you heard of any other stories like that before, Paul? You've done a lot of research around. Any other silly ones like that?
Yeah, obviously the famous one is the vampire associations with Highgate. But I think that's had the...
not vampire chickens.
Not vampire chickens, no. Or vampire foxes, either.
But if you...
I think that's obviously had an effect of blanking out and covering up more interesting and far more realistic stories that obviously your researchers...
that's what's going to be different about this book, isn't it? It's not about the vampire.
It's not just another vampire...
Is there mention of the vampire in it at all? Or?
There's a mention of the media hysteria surrounding the vampire, and there's extensive interviews with and a kind of chronology of the sightings of the entity in and around Swains Lane and the cemetery, which has become labelled as a vampire, which has its own validity. But not from a vampiric perspective, no.
No, but I imagine that there's been so many books written about it that we really want to hear what are the ghosts that are local here and find out more about that. And I think that's what the book's all about, isn't it? It's about where you could see, well, not where you could see, but probably where you can see.
It is
a ghost, but it's the stories, as Paul said, that get sort of
sublimated.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, in the book I cover domestic hauntings at quite some length. Obviously haunted pubs, haunted open spaces such as woodland and parks.
Oh, very cool.
There's a Harry Price connection with Highgate, isn't it? Is there was a poltergeist outbreak near one of the cemeteries?
You're thinking of Fairseat House. It's not terribly far from the cemetery. It's in Waterloo Park, and it's now a school. I think it's the Channing School. A lot of poltergeist activity, a lot of bell ringing. The police couldn't solve the mystery.
What sort of period does that date from?
I think it's 47.
Oh, right, okay. Right,
no, it may have been earlier, because it was during the establishment of a British restaurant, which was a kind of place where you could go if you'd been bombed out.
Is that included in Price's Poltergeist over England?
It is,
right,
yes.
That was from 1945, so
it must be
earlier.
A
little bit before
I think
43. Right, okay.
Feels right for that. Yeah.
Oh, that's very cool. Now, one of the ones that I'm interested in is, I believe that one of the brides in the Bath killings was in Highgate on Waterloo Road.
Yes, that's just down the road if you're going down towards Archway from Highgate. She only actually spent, I think, 2 nights, if I can't remember the lady's name.
Can you tell us about that?
2
Because
nights.
I'm not aware of what that is, what you've just mentioned, so it sounds pretty cool, though. So tell us about the brides in the bathtub.
A British serial killer, whose name escapes me.
I'm trying to find it.
What is his name?
Is it George?
Well, he had lots of names.
I have neglected to put it in my notes, which is really embarrassing. The victim
You
is
brought it
Margaret
up, John.
Elizabeth Lloyd. Yes, no, this is a big pants down woman. But essentially, he married several women and knocked them off and dissolved them in acid, didn't he?
No. He pulled them. He pulled them underneath the bathwater.
Oh, yes, sorry, and he drowned them and
drowned
drowned
them.
them. Yes, absolutely.
I think she was discovered by the landlady, or an alarm was raised, but she'd only been in Highgate for 2 nights, and I think, or 1 night, I think the day before she was murdered, he made her go up to Muswell Hill and remove all of her savings from the bank.
Oh, nice.
So he could look after them for her.
What years are we talking here?
Again, you've got me.
Decades? What, this century, last century?
Just before the sort of First World War.
Okay, so it's
that
that
sort of time.
I think it was when the road was still known as Bismarck Road, and the name was changed because of the war association to Waterloo Road. So, maybe 1930s.
All right, well, what we'll do is we're going to now, we'll break and we'll get John in here, John Pluce, to give us a chat about and tell us about why we're sitting in such a big theatre, but a spooky theatre. So we'll be back in a sec. Okay, now we're back here. We've got John Pluce with us, who's the owner and the artistic director of the upstairs at the Gatehouse. Welcome, John. Thank you for letting us come here. We know that you don't do it often, so,
That's
we're
all right.
delighted to be
Thank
here.
you very much for asking me.
Now, why are we sitting here? Why is this spooky, this place?
Why is it spooky? What a great question. I'm sure it's been spooky for years, and I've only known about it since we've taken over the building.
How long ago was that?
We actually occupied in 97, although I first looked at the building as a potential theatre in 1988, and before that I knew the building as a place to come and enjoy some music in the 60s, and also in the 70s. I think I played in a band here a couple of times for functions. It was basically a function room, so you could have your 21st birthday party here or your wedding reception and stuff like that. Then in the 80s we were looking for a venue for a theatre, because I've run a theatre company for a long time and we just got a bit fed up touring. As you get older, you just want to not work quite so hard. So we were looking for a venue, and we looked all over London, in fact, and we always knew about this place, but there was a lot of problems with it in the late 80s. It was owned by Grand Met, the big group hotel pub chain, famous for Watney's, if you can be famous for Watney's, I'm not sure, but and eventually they just closed the place down. It wasn't doing very good business, the pub that is, wasn't doing very good business at all, so they boarded it up in 1988. And then we looked at it straight away, but at the time they wanted a huge, the owners of the building wanted a huge amount of money for the building, the whole building, because it's not only the pub, there's also a restaurant next door, there's 7 flats in the whole complex. Wow. So we bided our time, and we needed someone else to come along and buy the rest of the bits of the building. And someone bought the restaurant eventually. Weatherspoons took over the pub downstairs. Then we started applying for licenses and all the sort of change of use and everything. So we eventually opened our doors on the 12th of December 1997.
So it's been quite a long, drawn-out process to get to where you are now.
It was at the time, yes.
And John, you mentioned to me that during the renovation process in the early 90s, that there was quite a lot of activity up here in the theatre area.
Sure. I mean, when I started researching the building, I discovered the tales of the ghost, and so I delved into it a bit more. I'm not particularly, I don't follow the paranormal things that other people do. I mean, I was just got interested because I suddenly owned a building where there was a ghost, so I started researching it and discovered a huge amount of material, especially in the local library. And which all led back to Mother Marnes, who was or is the ghost that haunts our bit of the building. I believe there is another ghost down in the pub, but I particularly researched Mother Marnes. And of course, as soon as you start researching it, you find all sorts of different accounts of why the ghost is there. Now, in a nutshell, I suppose, the ghost really comes from around about the 16th, 17th century, and as I say, there's so many stories. On this site used to be a courthouse. Now, a lot of people like to think that our theatre, as we sit in here now looking around it, it could be a courthouse. A lot of people like to think that it was, but we know that having done the research, that the courthouse was knocked down in the 1870s, and this building was built. It took about 5 years, apparently, to put this hall up. It was called the Highgate Hall when it opened, and it was opened as a sort of a Victorian music hall in 1895, mainly for the people that looked after the horses and carriages, because the Gatehouse was a staging post. It was the last stage out of London. You had to pay a toll to the Bishop of Middlesex to get out of London, or to get into London.
Mother Marnes is never going to get out.
And Mother Marnes is never going to get out of here. So going back to the courthouse, now the 3 stories are that either she was murdered and they had the trial here, or she murdered somebody and then was put on trial here, or my favourite story, and the one that seemed to hold more credibility when I read all the books and the research, was that there was she was murdered and the trial took place here, but the wrong person was convicted, and she has been haunting the courthouse ever since to try and get a retrial. Now, I have no idea which story is correct. I'm sorry.
There's also the possibility that there's more than one ghost upstairs. When we look at the balcony just behind us here, the stories associated with this balcony and the stairs leading up to the balcony, we have two landlords and a barman being pushed or falling down the stairs in fright, or having shocking experiences which require hospitalisation after seeing a spectre on that balcony, which appears to be wearing a black smock. You can't tell if it's male or female, and it has long grey or white hair parted in the middle. This could be Mother Marnes, I speculated, woken up in the middle of the night, perhaps in her nightie, not wearing the black hat that she's usually seen wearing, or It could be a totally separate entity.
Who knows? And we have had, several researchers come along and try and find out who exactly Mother Marnes is, or whether it is, as you say, is someone else, or two of them wandering around. I like to think it's Mother Marnes. She's been very friendly towards us. She's never done anything untoward.
Only the shoes, but
she moves
back.
shoes, but at least she doesn't steal them. She just seems to have a shoe fetish, because a lot of actors and actresses have had their shoes moved in the dressing room, and they've come in, the next day and said, "Where's my shoes? I left them right there." And then we find them at either the other end of the dressing room, or on the stage, or somewhere else. And the actors, and who don't know the story, the actors swear blind, "I left my shoes there." And it's happened more than once. I mean, several times. So it's not a sort of coincidence. I think she has a shoe fetish.
I think she does, and I think it's also significant. I've conducted an extensive interview with a landlord who had the Gatehouse in 1965 and 66, and he found it very frequently there were footsteps heard in the bar, moving across from the flat across to what was then a kitchen, but what is now your box office area, or the kind of lobby, as if one was standing in front of the counter. And from what I can tell with where your dressing room is, it appears that the shoes are on that trajectory of the footsteps that were heard. Whether that's significant or not, I don't know.
I don't know. I really don't. And the shoes have never completely disappeared. They've always been found. So she hasn't run off with any shoes. Yes, the footsteps thing, we had, when we first came here, we quite often had the occupants of the flat, which at the moment is the assistant pub manager, ask us what we were doing there at 3:00 in the morning, when of course we weren't there.
You didn't even have keys at one point, did you?
Right at the beginning we didn't know, but even now this happened. I suppose the last time, I'm trying to remember, maybe 5 years ago, when one of the occupants of the flat there asked us why we were there at 3 in the morning, because they heard footsteps coming from what is now our green room. Who's walking around? I have no idea.
And who's setting off the burglar alarm?
We did have that. When we put the burglar alarm in, the actual the sensor in the theatre where we're sitting now kept going off always, and it was always around about 3:00 in the morning, maybe 10:03, maybe 10 past, but it was always around about 3:00, and I got woken up several times at home by the burglar alarm company saying your burglar alarm's going off, and they investigated. They, a couple of, I think burglar alarms tend to go off if spiders crawl across them, but we don't have spiders. We have very few animals in here. And they couldn't find a reason for it going off. And all the other burglar, the sensors are fine. The ones on the stairs are fine. The ones in the box office and the ones in the front door. But the one in the auditorium where we're sitting now I got fed up with getting woken up at 3 in the morning, so we disconnected it. That's one of there's been several incidents happen. I'm looking now up onto the gallery, and there is a large bench, a wooden bench, which our lighting and sound desk sit on. Now, that was originally down here in the auditorium, and when we eventually took control of the building, and up to the years between Wetherspoons took the place over in 93, the pub downstairs, it took us 4 years to get the licenses, and we had to get permission from the transport authorities for the traffic. I mean, it's a huge story. And in those 4 years, Wetherspoons, rather cheekily, used this room as a storage area for old stuff. And when we eventually got in here to start planning the theatre in the beginning of '97, it was full of fridges and bar tops and beer barrels. And literally, as we sit here now, it's difficult to imagine, but this whole area was just full of old pub stuff. And then when we finally signed the lease and got the permission to move in, they had to clear that. And the only thing I asked them to leave was that wooden bench, because I thought that would be rather nice to keep our lighting and sound desk on. And it was, at one point, when they cleared all the refrigerators out, it was sat in the middle, almost where we are now. Right in the middle, we have a picture of it. I thought it would be a rather nice picture, have this huge empty room with one wooden bench in the middle. And we came in the next morning and the bench was moved and it was under that window over there. And no one had access to the place. Well, the pub manager did, and he said, why would I crawl up in the middle of the night and move your bench? So that was a completely unexplained phenomenon. We know we left it here, and it moved. Now, I know very little of ghosts, whether they're capable of moving large wooden benches or not. I don't know.
Interestingly enough, the area where the bench was moved to, Jack O'Connell, his name is, the old landlord I interviewed, his children saw Mother Marns very frequently. I mean, often nightly. It was so normal to them, they didn't think anything of it, and often during the daytime as well. And there was one occasion where his oldest son was in this room, probably round about where we're sitting now, and he looked across to the window, and of course we didn't have all the blackout curtains as you have here. He could see straight out, and Mother Marns was looking straight back in.
And that is quite high off the ground there.
For
someone to be looking through that window, well, I mean, it's impossible.
What does she look like? What's she supposed to look like, this Mother Marns?
This is another interesting thing which John Kaneko James is probably interested in particularly. The way stories get distorted through retelling. She's meant to traditionally wear black and have a cat. None of the people I've spoken to who claim to have seen her say that she's, or know people like yourself, John, who know people who've seen her, say that she wears black, she wears grey. Mm-hmm. She also has no cat. Whether animal ghosts fade quicker than human ghosts, I'm not sure, possibly. Whoa. Unless they're chickens, apparently. Yes. But she has a wide-brimmed hat, which is typical of a certain fashion in London during the 1600s.
Yes, I mean, the black for the 1600s would be very, very unusual. I mean, was she supposed to be very wealthy?
We don't know. I mean, allegedly robbed for her money.
Well, in that case, she might have been wearing black, because black was a colour that was very expensive. It took 6 processes to dye fabric into black, and it fades so easily. I mean, it's one of the biggest misconceptions when you look at a portrait from the 17th century. You see these people in black with white lace collars and maybe a bit of gold thread, and they seem very sober to us, but that's very, very blinging. That's very gangster. That is conspicuous show of wealth, because lace was expensive, black was expensive. So to have somebody wandering about in black, to us it's a shabby sort of witch-like figure, but somebody with the big brimmed hat, somebody with the black, that'd be very gangster. Very showy.
And all the people I've spoken to that have seen Mother Marns, or seen the ghost, seen the figure anyway, have described her in grey. And since we've been here 17 years, 3 people have claimed to have seen Mother Marns in the vicinity of where we're sitting. One was a director, and the other 2 were actors, and they didn't know the story. I mean, you know, when the subject of Mother Marns comes up with a cast of actors and you discuss it, and everyone, oh, is there a ghost? And the people that have reported seeing Mother Marns, they were not in on that sort of conversation, only afterwards. The first one was a director who said she saw her in the green room, which is the room next to the flat, and there's a tiny corridor which leads down to the owners of the flat there. She saw a figure disappearing into that corridor.
Again, in one of the oldest parts of the building.
Yeah, it's part of it's old part of the building. The actor who I was rehearsing in here. It was a play about James Dean, the actor, It was called Come Back to the Five and Dime Jimmy Dean. It's a lovely play. It was also a movie in the 80s with starring Cher, but that's beside the point. But Josh, the actor, was late for rehearsal one day. We were in here. There's a cast of 8 women and 1 man in the play, and the 8 ladies and myself were in here rehearsing the play. There was no one else in the building at all. Josh came in late, came through those doors, oh, hi, Josh, you're late. Yeah, I'm sorry, la-di-da. And he said, by the way, who was that old lady sitting outside? What old lady, we all said, and of course we immediately opened the door and there was no old lady. And Josh says he saw a lady in grey sitting on the chair, and as you pointed out to me, it's a very modern chair.
You brought it from Camden, didn't you?
I think I did. It came from our old office in Camden.
Yeah.
It's a very ordinary office chair, but it's always sat there. It's a big soft chair, and we actually use it for disabled people who are waiting if we can't open the doors to the show, and that's the chair for anyone who has mobility problems to sit in. Josh came in and said there was a female, what he considered to be a female because it was a grey dress. It was quite interesting. All 3 people have never been able to describe the face of whoever it is. It's sort of shrouded. And I've questioned them, what did it look like? They haven't been able to tell us. It's a female shape in a long grey dress.
Well, that's very interesting because that's something that I've picked up on a lot of ghost sightings, is that when people see apparitions, they see a figure, they see the clothing, they can describe the clothing in great detail, but the face is often not seen, or it's only seen from the side, or it's seen, or it looks like the figure's looking down. So that's
and
quite
and that's how Josh described it. And then an actress saw someone going in the toilet, followed by a figure. And again, it was a figure with a long grey dress on, and was astounded to see someone go in the toilet, which is just behind that door that we're looking at over there, and see someone go in behind them. And when they came out, who went in the toilet with you was a sort of immediate. And of course, the person in the toilet, there was no one in here with me, but she said she definitely saw someone going in. Again, it was a back view. There was no face. It was a flowing grey dress. No hat, no cat. Definitely no hat and no cat.
Where does the cat come from, Della? What is this tradition of Mother Marn's cat?
Well, as we were just discussing, none of us, neither John or myself, know of anyone who claims to have actually seen the cat. This is something that gets retold in books about the paranormal, which dip into Highgate, and most of it is regurgitated and impossible to trace back to source. I think it's highly likely that the ghost cat has come from the tourist trade in the early 1800s, if possibly the late 1700s. First port of call for people visiting Highgate is going to be Highgate Hill. The first pub you go in is the Whittington and Cat. In the Whittington and Cat window for many, many years there was a kind of mummified cat which was found in the chimney, and a skeletal rat. The pub's actually closed now. I did try to trace the cat. I can't. I think the landlord took it with him. Oh. But it was also in the back of the pub for years. So people coming up Highgate Hill, it's quite a gruesome visual thing, getting regaled with this tale of Dick Whittington and his cat. End up at the Gatehouse, last pub along, unless you're going up to Hampstead. By this time, maybe a little bit worse for wear. Possibly getting involved with the swearing on the horn ceremony, or having a bit of a jolly up and getting regaled, maybe with tales of Mother Marns. And somehow this cat could have got jumbled up with it.
Yeah. I'm not just thinking there is a tendency all through sort of myth and reporting of these things to add an animal companion to figures. Poor old Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, the German philosopher, the guy who wrote the 3 books of occult philosophy, etc. After his death, and he'd never had a pet in his life, apparently, after his death he was given this black hound with amazing supernatural powers that went everywhere with him. And again, there's no record that he even liked animals. He professed a dislike of animals and had never had a pet in his life.
I've got a theory also about another common myth about Mother Marns, that she will never appear when there are children or animals in the pub. Again, rubbish. Yes. The O'Connell children lived here for 2 years, and at least 3 of them saw her, as I said, very regularly, almost considered her to be a kind of friend. Never saw the cat. They also had a Jack Russell Terrier called Cappy. Cappy was completely nonplussed, not bothered at all by Mother Marns, in the same room as her when she appeared many times. So that's
interesting, isn't it? Because normally animals and dogs are quite sort of sensitive to
Yeah, so I think she must be pretty friendly if he wasn't bothered by her.
Well, let's go have a look. John's going to bring us around and show us some things. So what we'll do is we'll break and we'll come back and we'll have a wander around with the microphone and have some more thoughts about this.
Absolutely.
Okay, now we're about to start walking through the Gatehouse, or upstairs at the Gatehouse. You could tell us, John, where we're actually...
We're headed towards the door that the audience used to come in and out, and we're also headed towards the famous chair where one of the actors saw. This is the very same chair. It's a bog standard office chair, which came from our old offices in Camden. And that's where, now these doors, they're just behind us now, they were shut. I was rehearsing in the auditorium. Josh came in through the doors, walked past the lady, and I think because he was late and he was in such a rush, perhaps if you'd seen someone there, he might have stopped to talk. But because he knew he was late, and actors being late is a real pain because we're trying to rehearse a scene and someone's not there. So he didn't. He just bowled straight into the room. He could hear us in there. And then he turned around and said, who was the lady sat outside? And we all came back, and of course the chair is as empty as we see it now.
And this is interesting as well, as I've said probably about 3 times, so we're the core of the old building, of the original building. And this is, as you say, where Mother Mars has been seen on the chair, moving through, is very close to where she's seen moving through to follow people into the toilet. We're not far from the green room. And also we're standing at the bottom of the stairs that lead up to the balcony.
It's because we're very compact. This is a fringe theatre. I mean, it's not a vast space like a West End theatre, so everything is very close to...
Even the ghosts. You've got your smuggler, if it's a smuggler, in the smoke upstairs, and the distance is only 20 feet between the 2 ghosts, if in fact they are different ghosts.
Indeed. 20 feet takes us up to the gallery. Should we go up and have a...
Yep, let's go.
Have a look up quite a narrow staircase. I mean, the Victorians built this staircase. Presumably, they had bands and things, or orchestras maybe playing up here on the gallery. I'm sure they didn't have the sound and lighting equipment that we have. So we're up at...
And David Saunderson's actually standing where I was standing when I felt the very strong female presence behind me last year. So don't get scared, Dave.
It's a little bit squishy here, isn't it?
A little bit squishy. I mean, normally 2 or 3... excuse me. 2 or 3 people work up here. I'm sure the Victorians didn't envisage all the technical equipment that we have nowadays, radio mics, and if there's video in the play, the projector will be operated from up here. So this is the area where, again, people have felt, as you have, a presence of someone. Maybe she likes to look down on the play. We've often wanted to have her appear in, if we've done a Shakespeare in Hamlet or the Scottish play, we've often wanted her to be up here.
And you have the Scottish play in November, don't you?
We have it coming up. We have the Scottish play yet again in November, and as I'm sure your listeners will know, we're not allowed to mention the name of it because it's highly superstitious in the world of theatre to mention the Scottish play, so we won't. But
so John, where we're standing now, John, we could actually see the big on-off switch, can't we?
Well, there's lots of on-off switches. I'm not sure if that's the one that was referred to by...
It does say main isolation switch, which would imply to me it's the big, heavy one, which moved by itself in 1976.
Yes.
Freaked out the relief manager.
There's a lot of old equipment up here. There's what they used to call air conditioning in those days. There's the huge motors either side on these brown tubes. It's a shame they put it in. I know it sort of spoilt the whole place really, but I suppose in 1963 they felt they had to have some sort of air conditioning. We've got modern air conditioning now, which is just the very small units in the roof here. There is a big roof above us, which accesses through that trapdoor. I have never ever been up there. I poked my head and looked, and it is that thick, and we're on radio, so how we say, about 6 inches thick in pigeon pigeon poo.
Yeah.
It's because the period when the building was derelict, we had pigeons in here, and especially in the roof area, and it's really not nice at all up there. So I've never wanted or been up there. The pigeons lived in a cupboard, which is the other side of our fire escape, which we actually called the Pigeon Room for years until we actually eventually now call it the Costume Store, because that's what's in there.
And this, you're sitting, John, aren't you, on the bench?
I'm sitting on the very bench that got moved
by
that one night by itself. I hope no one came in here and played a trick on us. I don't think anyone would have had any reason to do that, and it was very difficult to access the building. Apparently, at the time, it was in between us negotiating the deal and actually finalising the deal, so only the pub manager had the key. So this is the very bench that moved, and this is the view that hopefully Mother Marnes has when she comes to see a show. One day I'm going to get the money off her for a ticket, but I'd love to know why the Victorians, made a gallery. I like to think it was for musicians, but we have no pictorial and no written evidence of what happened up here.
What do you think about this place, Paul?
It's got a great atmosphere to it. It's really good.
You've been in a lot of theatres before, John, and what do you think?
This is a very, very sort of typical fringe theatre, right down to the ghost story, because the ghost story that John told us about the ghost going through the door into the toilet, that is very, very, very similar to a story at the Rose where I do a lot of work, where one day one of the volunteers, because that's a volunteer-run charity, and was sitting there, and during a show, a person in what looked like a sort of Jacobean linen shift and breeches dashed through the main doors and then just jinked into the area where they keep their sound desk, which is a tiny space. I mean, it's about the size of the space where we are now standing. And, of course, the volunteer shot in after this person, only to find a very confused sound engineer sitting there sort of wondering why this person had jumped into the sound desk during a show. Well, there is a theory, isn't there, and I know Paul knows a lot about this as well, where that electricity can feed psychic activity. And as you noted, there's an awful lot of equipment here.
Well, there's lots of equipment here.
And this is a nucleus for it, where we're standing here. Mm-hmm. It could, but then of course it wouldn't have been in the 1960s, and this is where the smuggler, the male, we presume it's male, or Mother Marnes just got out of bed, figure.
Just before you go on, why Mother Marnes? You don't know who she is, but you have a name for her. How does that work?
Well, my friend Ian Topham, you've probably heard of.
I know Ian Topham.
Ian Topham, very prolific contributor to Fortiana. He sussed out that there was a lady called Judith Barnes, who was known as Widow Barnes, who lived here, and very close to here, adjacent. So she may, because of the complications of property transactions in the 17th century in Highgate, it's very likely that she could have lived here. She certainly lived within 10, 20 feet of here. 1670 odds, she could be a possible candidate, and then maybe the name has got merged into Marnes. Barnes. I mean, if I may, I'd like to agree to some extent with Deb, because spellings of names are one of the things that vary insanely in any document of that time. We did not have such a thing really as spelling at that time, and so if you look at documents even of trials where they're trying to get every name consistently right, you get in 3 separate trial documents 3 very different names. Yes. Mm-hmm. So yes, I could easily believe that somebody was Barnes in one document, Marnes in another. Oh, my legs are going all tingly just while we're talking about this very specific thing to do with the name, Judith Barnes. Yes,
I mean, in all the books I've read, and I read many when we took over the building, it was Mother Marnes. I don't think anyone questioned that was her name. And you're right. I think spelling mistakes and typos. I mean, I've just seen a legal document now. It's prepared by a solicitor, and they've actually there's a typo in it on one of the main names of the people involved in the document.
Are you all right, Della? You were a bit shaky there, just for a sec there.
I actually am getting really tingly, just like I was before when we were up on the balcony.
I must say, we've talked to other people interested in the psychic phenomena, and they've come up here, and 1 or 2 have said that they feel a presence, whatever happens. One of them was an American, and I wasn't taking too much notice. Oh dear. But the American lady who was here, just was walking around the place saying that she felt this and she felt that and she felt tingling and goodness knows what.
Would you say this is the most sort of haunted spot in the building? Do you think?
You know, the green room I know the American lady was in the green room and was saying that the whole in that area downstairs, she felt a presence down there. Someone felt one at the bottom of the stairs here once when they were walking around. But yes, quite often up here, as Della has said, people have felt whatever you feel. I have never felt it. I often stand up here and look down and feel something about the acting that's going on the stage, but never...
Well, let's go down the green room. We'll finish up down there and just and see what's going down there. So
absolutely.
You want to... I'll follow down Paul and John going down there. Hopefully don't hurt ourselves, breaking our backs or something.
No, we don't add any more ghosts to the pub.
No, it's a very small and spindly sort of staircase we're going down here.
Absolutely.
So John, what do you think? You know, you've said that this is almost an archetypal fringe theatre.
Right down to the fact that by their sound desk they have a torch on a hook with a sign that says "The torch lives here always," which I have seen at almost every fringe theatre I've ever been to.
Well, what is it about theatres though? Because I mean, we've done a lot of stuff down Drury Lane where we've.
You know what? That's a question that I spoke about with a friend of mine who's not into the paranormal at all. He's a theatre professional. He's worked in a number of big West End theatres, and he was saying he's never known a theatre that didn't have a ghost. Possibly, I mean, his argument, he's not a believer in any way, is that, of course, theatres tend to be old buildings. They tend to be buildings where people are alone at night, quite often after or before a show. And that sort of building, he believes, is very conducive to the atmosphere of seeing or hearing something. It's also the fact that theatre is a form of ritual, or you could argue more anthropologically, ritual is an early form of theatre. You know. I
mean, I've spent my life in the theatre, and I've toured and been into so many theatres that have had ghosts. I worked at the Theatre Royal in Windsor for about 3 years. And that's, the ghost is really well known and has been studied. And she is supposed to have lived in this corridor, a backstage stairs corridor where all the props were kept. And I was stage manager there for 3 years. I often had to go up in that corridor. And yeah, it was a bit freaky because it was a lonely place, and it was right at the back of the building. And everyone said that's where the ghost lives, and I was sort of in my teens and a stage manager, and I'm going, I've only come up here to get a prop, and I keep looking over my shoulder. But I think there's so many theatres that have a ghost and have been seen in the stalls or on the stage, and we'd all like to think that the ghost was part of the play, and I don't think that's ever been recorded that a real ghost has taken the role in Hamlet, or that would be far too much to expect of a ghost to come in on cue.
There is one ghostly anecdote about theatre, or although it's more sort of a supernatural appearance, it's at the Rose Theatre.
Right.
And the story is with Edward Alleyn, one of the big sort of idols of the sort of late 16th century in theatre, was performing in Dr. Faustus. And it's during a scene in Faustus where the devil and all his sins come to tempt Faustus and to persuade him to sell his soul. And the story goes that one day they did that scene, and Alleyn came off stage absolutely furious, yelling at everybody he could find, because somebody he thought had let one of the audience to stand on stage.
Really?
And they sort of said, well, no, it wasn't. And Alleyn, being furious, said, look, he was even going along with the play. How could you allow that to happen? You should have shoved him off. And they said, look, we swear, Edward, there was nobody but us on stage. And he convinced himself that the devil had actually come to see his performance of Faustus.
Well, who knows? Actors come up with strange tales. Just going back to this room, we're standing in the room where the footsteps were heard, and just over to my right here, this is the wall between this room and the flat next door, and there's a little corridor that leads down there to an entrance into there is a connecting door into the flat, which is it's sealed up, but this is the room where the occupants of the flat heard the footsteps.
And also, John, I think you mentioned to me that there was a dragging noise, like a heavy object being shuffled or dragged about.
Yeah, that was one of the descriptions from one of the managers. It's either
3 a.m. again.
Yeah, it's either the manager or the assistant manager, because the 3 flats here are part of the pub now, and they're owned by Wetherspoons, who own the pub, and their staff occupy. And their staff, there's quite a high turnover, so there's been several different people with different stories about footsteps and things being dragged. The doors, if we go along a little bit this way, I'll show you where there used to be a door here, here across this. We've knocked it through now to become our box office, but there was a door right in this area here, which was where the door was locked when in between the period where we started to negotiate and we couldn't get in, and the door was locked from the inside by the pub manager, who apparently then walked away towards that corridor which leads down into the pub, and as he walked away he heard a knocking on the door, and that was the story from that particular pub manager. There was no one here, we'd all long gone, we couldn't be in here, we didn't own the place at the time. Pub manager locked the door, walked away, knocked on the door.
Where we're standing right now, also in my book I mentioned an interview with one of the old landlords here. He and his head barman were downstairs in the bar. 2 off-duty police officers came in for a late-night drink. All of them heard the footsteps and also heard the sound of male and female voices right where we're standing here. This used to be a kitchen, raised in argument. That was really scary. So just somebody opening the door. This is actually the door. The policeman and the landlord burst through. Barman and the other policeman opposite side of this kitchen could still hear the noises inside, burst this door open, came in brandishing their truncheons at each other. Nothing here, no knives disturbed. All 4 of them heard it.
Okay, well, on that note...
Could I ask just one
more thing?
We'll literally
yeah.
1 more minute. John, I've noticed, as we've been going around, there are lots of what look to my untrained eye like little security cameras around. There was one kind of trained on us as we were sitting in the theatre room. Have you ever caught anything strange on the cameras?
Nothing at all, no. I mean, we only have 3 cameras. They're just our security, and no, cool. Never. We've never actually ever seen anything like that on the security cameras. Maybe she's shy, camera shy, unlike most of the actors that we have here.
All right, well, that's the much time we've got for today. Thank you, John, for inviting us into the upstairs at the Gatehouse.
Thank you very well. Thank you for asking me. I'm always happy to talk about it. I love. I'm a great fan of small scale theatre and everything that goes with it. And apart from all the shows that we do here, the Ghost is part of we've inherited Mother Mons or whoever she is, and so I'm very happy to talk about it, and hope your listeners find it interesting.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Della. We look forward to when your book comes out next month.
Thanks, David. Not long now.
No, not long now. Thank you, John Kaneko James. Thank you, Paul Smith. This is David Saunders from the Spooky Isles.
Paul Smith? Paul Adams?
Paul Adams. That was Paul Smith.
You're losing it.
Thank you, Paul Adams. That's all we have today for the Spooky Isles.
You have been listening to the Spooky Isles, hosted by David Saunderson and John Kaneko James with assistance from Lorcan Maguire. You can visit the Spooky Isles website for more tales of ghosts, horror, and dark history in the UK and Ireland at spookyisles.com. This is Anthony M. R. Lewis speaking.